Thank you, Lisa Owen and Checkpoint. Lisa Owen, Checkpoint up next. I'm Wallace Chapman back 3:45. See you tomorrow.
Kei te whakaronga mai koe ki te reo irarangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Nita Blake-Persen. E haere aki nei, the government unveils a big boost to its no jab, no job mandates. Hairdressers, hospitality and gym staff are the latest cab off the rank. We speak to the Workplace Relations Minister about how it will work and what happens if it doesn't. Schools back in session as thousands of Auckland teenagers return to the classroom, but low vaccination rates mean some students are still opting for lockdown learning. Visa woes are creating more headaches for desperately needed health workers. The Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency heads to court in a bid for Maori vaccine information, and our Black Caps prepare to face off against Pakistan in what's been dubbed a chance for vengeance. You can watch us live on Facebook, Freeview Channel 50 and Sky Channel 83.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Kia ora, good afternoon. I'm Sarah Bradley. People working in hospitality, events and other close contact businesses, such as gyms and hairdressers, will be required to be vaccinated. The requirement, announced by the Prime Minister this afternoon, applies to anyone who works for a business where customers need to provide a vaccine certificate to gain entry. People who cannot be vaccinated due to medical reasons will be exempt. Jacinda Ardern denies the move punishes those who aren't vaccinated and is simply about keeping people safe.
Questions would rightly be asked if we required those who are customers to be vaccinated, but not the people that were serving them or working in hospitality or those barbers or those places where vaccine certificates were being used. So this is about creating an environment where it makes sense.
The new mandate covers about a quarter of the country's workforce. An Auckland high school principal says just over half of her senior students have returned to class today. School has resumed in Auckland and much of Waikato for year 11 to 13 students. Some schools have decided not to open, and Onehunga High School principal Deirdre Shea says some students aren't ready to come back yet. But she says for those who have, it's been a positive experience.
Look, today's gone really well. We began the day with a number of us out welcoming students coming in and, of course, waving to their families as they dropped them off, which many people did, and we understand that. A small majority of our senior students have returned, so we weren't sure about numbers. There's sort of 55 to 60% of them back today.
Deirdre Shea expects that number to grow in the coming days as students become more confident about returning. The Crown claims that releasing Maori vaccination data to Whānau Ora providers would be a breach of privacy and could hinder the vaccine rollout. The Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency is trying to get individual vaccine data for Maori to create a tailored rollout. Lawyers for the Crown told the High Court at Wellington today that it's reluctant to release such private information and would only do so as a last resort. They said the Health Ministry is taking a wait-and-see approach and vaccination rates for Māori are improving without releasing the information. They also said there's a concern that releasing the data could further undermine efforts in a community that's already sceptical of the state. The Thames Coromandel Mayor says she hasn't changed her personal vaccination views despite supporting the government's rollout at the council meeting today. The Mayor, Sandra Gowdy, said earlier this month she wouldn't get the Pfizer shots. She wants the Novavax vaccine instead. This stirred widespread criticism from residents and some fellow councillors. The Mayor and councillors this morning supported a motion endorsing the government's vaccination program and recommending immunisation for staff and elected members. Sandra Gowdy says it was important for the council to back the motion.
It's good for the unity of council, and so we'll just move on.
She says her decision not to get the Pfizer jabs is a separate matter. The Immigration Minister says an Afghan woman whose life is at risk from the Taliban can apply again for a visa, though she is not a priority group. She missed out on a residency visa in 2019 due to Immigration Department delays and last month was knocked back for a humanitarian visa. Authorities have held her passport for 3 years. The Minister, Chris Farfoy, says he's already approved 1,300 visas and brought close to 500 people back.
We've prioritised those who've had some kind of connection to working with agencies, and I think in the last 2 or 3 weeks again, we've also said that we're looking at other ways that we might be able to increase our support.
The woman is not linked to any New Zealand agencies such as the Defence Force. The Minister in a later statement said 70 individuals from Afghanistan were being helped by New Zealand officials in the next stage of their travel. The death of Maori All Blacks player Sean Wainui is being investigated as a suspected suicide. Coroner Luella Dunn confirmed earlier today the investigation and also made interim suppression orders around the circumstances of the 25-year-old rugby player's death. And an unusually subdued royal marriage has taken place in Japan. There's been no elaborate ceremony and no reception banquet. The BBC's Viv Marsh has more.
The marriage of Princess Mako, the niece of Emperor Naruhito, has been making the wrong sort of headlines. Her relationship with Kei Komuro, who works for a US law firm, has been widely criticised by the Japanese media and public. At the root of the trouble is a financial dispute in Komuro's family. The negative coverage has apparently made the princess ill. As is customary in Japan, she'll lose her royal status by marrying a commoner, but she's also turned down a large payment that's traditionally offered to women who leave the imperial household.
To sport, and Black Caps captain Kane Williamson still hopes to be a key contributor in the side's opening T20 Cricket World Cup match against Pakistan in Sharjah tomorrow morning, despite not being fully fit. Pakistan have hit the ground running, coming off a 10-wicket win over India in their first game, while the Black Caps lost their last 2 warm-up matches against Australia and England. Williamson didn't bat in the England game as he continues to nurse a chronic elbow injury.
It's just been an ongoing sort of challenge to deal with it regarding loading and these sorts of things. So it's just a work in progress, but I think all in all it's showing improvement.
The match starts at 3 a.m. Also tonight, South Africa play the West Indies, with both sides coming off losses in their first games. Moana Pacifica have signed 2 more players for next year's Super Rugby competition, with Hurricanes players Lolangi Visiniaa and Danny Toaloa joining the new franchise. Former men's world tennis number 1 Andy Murray has enjoyed his first win over a top 10 player in more than a year. He's beaten Poland's Hubert Hurkacz in the first round of the Vienna Open. And a pair of sneakers that weren't Nike Air Jordans but were worn by Michael Jordan during an NBA game have sold for a record $2 million. Jordan wore the shoes in 1984 and are his earliest game-worn shoes to come on the market and predate the launch of his Air Jordan brand. And that's the news.
School bells ring again.
I have a lot of excitement. I'm just really excited to see my friends, and I'm also excited just to get out of the house for a little bit and not just to go shopping.
Some are excited, some are worried.
There's also a lot of people that are quite anxious about it because of their own health, their family's health, anxious about how it's going to go down.
Principals, get ready.
It's been, 10 weeks since we were together. That brings its own nervousness.
An A for COVID effort. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
And we are funded through New Zealand On Air. Now it's time for the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Western areas from Northland to Wellington, mainly fine today, with just a few showers about the hills. Scattered rain at times tomorrow. Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupo, mostly cloudy with patchy light rain or drizzle, but fine breaks this afternoon. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa, mainly fine, high cloud tomorrow, a few afternoon and evening showers in southern Hawke's Bay and the Tararua district. For Nelson and Marlborough, cloudy periods, rain this evening in Nelson and inland Marlborough. Buller, Westland and Fiordland, occasional rain, easing to a few showers this afternoon, then clearing. Fine spells tomorrow, but showers return in southern Westland from afternoon. For Canterbury, Otago and Southland, low cloud or fog morning and night, a few showers mainly afternoon and evening, with isolated thunderstorms and hail from southern Canterbury to Southland. And at the Chatham Islands, cloudy with occasional drizzle. This is RNZ National. It's coming up to 8.5 minutes past 5. I'll have the news headlines at 5:30.
Kia ora, Sarah. Tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai haere mai ki Checkpoint I tēnei rā. I'm Nita Blake-Persen. The government announced a major expansion of its vaccine mandate. Workers employed by businesses that require customers to present a vaccine certificate will now also need to be fully immunised. About a quarter of the entire workforce is expected to be covered by this sweeping order. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says this requirement will come into force when the country moves to the new traffic light framework.
This requirement means staff and customers are treated equally, and it will play a big part in helping to minimise the spread of the virus in the highest risk venues by reducing the potential for COVID to enter the business in the first place, and further supports our businesses in their economic recovery.
Workplace Relations and Safety Minister Michael Wood says employers will be given a clear risk assessment process to follow when deciding if they can require vaccination for different types of work. This will be done through a new law. He says a new 4-week notice period will also apply to people whose employment is terminated for refusing to get the vaccine.
The change will only apply to employees who do not have a notice period, or if that period is shorter than 4 weeks. This will effectively be the start of a countdown. Once the notice period commences, the employee will have that amount of time to get vaccinated. Provided it is reasonable to do so, the employee will be able to retain their employment if they get vaccinated in that period, but their employment will be terminated if they do not. Other aspects of employment law will not change, and employers and employees will continue to both need to behave in good faith.
The government is also requiring employers to give their staff paid time off to get vaccinated and must also keep a record of their workers' vaccination status. Ministers have agreed to give WorkSafe an additional $4.4 million to enforce the new mandate. We'll speak to the minister shortly. But first, there was no update today for Auckland pupils and parents about when children in younger year levels will go back to school. But some Auckland students have returned to the classroom for the first time in over 2 months. However, case numbers and low vaccination rates are keeping many at home, and some school gates are staying shut. Reporter Louise Tenuth and camera operator Marika Habazi went back to the classroom.
At James Cook High School in Manurewa, this is back to school, level 3 style. Staff need a negative test, there's a different kind of sign-in, masks, socially distanced desks, hand sanitizer around every corner, windows and doors open for ventilation, and lots of cleaning. For years 11 to 13, this is not how they envisioned their last term.
It's interesting. It's definitely different. There's definitely more expectations put on students, like with the mask wearing. You have to wear it all the time. You know how you can't really breathe well. And there's just so much that's going on. Different things you have to expect and things to worry about with your learning and NCEA. So it's pretty stressful.
It helps reduce the stress, I guess. So I'm not alone, at home and stuff.
Principal Grant McMillan is pleased with the numbers so far.
Prepared for maybe a third, maybe a couple of hundred, but planning for maybe a fifth or a sixth. It looks like we've got far more than that. We've just run out of our student handbooks, and I printed a couple of hundred of those off, maybe 300 over the weekend. So we will know at the end of the day.
Now their task is to get both the students who've returned to the classroom and the ones still at home through their crucial NCEA assessments. He says it's vital students don't have to choose between education or supporting their family.
A number of our students are helping with their families' incomes right now by working. That's okay. We can fit their learning around that. They don't have to force to choose one or the other. So the real challenge for us is how we look after our senior students, particularly 12, 13s who are off-site, and support them to also achieve their qualifications.
But it'll take longer than the time they've got left, and they could be working through the summer months to get there, even with delayed exams. That's why he's disappointed Auckland schools haven't had more of a say in the education decisions.
And in some ways it's a shame that people on the ground who are actually facing the stuff day to day aren't being pulled into advisory groups or little quiet focus groups. Don't make any noise about it. Just to share our thinking and our experience so those in Wellington can make the call.
Year 11 Dean and Senior Science teacher Ardeel Adams says today's a relief after rocky remote learning.
Yeah, it's been up and down. First 2 weeks I'd say they were pretty good. I had a decent turnout. I had about close to 60% turnout, and then it just tapered off a bit, and then it was a bit up and down. I'm excited to be back because it just gives me a sense of normality, sense of sort of certainty I can do something with my students.
They've already held vaccination events at the school, and this Thursday there'll be another one on offer for parents too. The uptake has been good so far, but at Kia Aroha College, vaccinations are nowhere near where Principal Hayley Mill wants them to be.
Of the ones that are eligible for vaccination, 23% are fully vaxxed and 19% have one dose. It was a real concern for us about whether or not we were prioritising education and jeopardising people's health.
That's just one of the reasons they haven't reopened today. Poor ventilation, worries about rule breaking and concern from parents all stacked up. She says it didn't feel right to open up.
Not being able to attend a tangihanga, not being able to attend church services in person. There's a statement from the ministry that says staff meetings should be discouraged. So we were just really concerned about how all of that plays out. None of those things are safe, but let's have a whole heap of young people in a classroom together.
Especially with growing cases and locations of interest on their doorstep.
For the last 7 weeks, we've been tracking locations of interest. Up to 50% of those have been within a 5k radius of our school site.
The schools put these concerns in a letter to the Ministry of Education, echoing the call to have more of a say in what decisions are made for their community.
Decisions are being made from privileged positions where I don't think that too many people really understand the complexities that communities like ours are managing and navigating.
They're hoping next time there will be more warning.
The announcement without any type of heads up then requires young people to make a decision between do they help their families put food on their tables or do they return to school for a few weeks.
For now, they'll remain learning online until vaccination rates are up, but attendance is dwindling and it's not sustainable long term.
It is 15 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Well, returning now to our top story. The government has announced the COVID vaccine will be compulsory for all workers at businesses where customers need to show a vaccine certificate. So that includes cafes, restaurants, gyms and hairdressers. The Workplace Relations and Safety Minister Michael Wood joins me now. Tēnā koe, Minister.
Kia ora.
Can I start by being crystal clear about who this will apply to?
The announcements that we've made today mean that there will be a mandate in place for those workers who are working in workplaces where the COVID vaccine certificate is being used. And that's really important. That's about consistency because patrons who are coming into those workplaces will have to show their vaccination status. And we think it's important the workers in those workplaces have the same requirement. We have also created the ability for us to be able to consider mandates in places where there might be critical impacts in terms of New Zealand's exporting interests and also for critical national infrastructure.
Just in terms of understanding specifically who that is, because we're already getting correspondence from people wanting to know, example, taxis and Uber drivers.
Those are not areas of work who are covered by the COVID vaccine certificates. Those areas are a smaller group, including hospitality, events, gyms, gatherings, and close contact businesses.
Right.
But what we have also agreed today is that ministers are going to go and do some further work to consider whether there should be some further areas who are added to these requirements.
Well, other areas, funeral home staff?
No, I'm not going to speculate on that, but ministers are going to do some work on that. We've been working closely with our social partners, Business New Zealand, other business sector groups and the CTU, and we'll be having ongoing conversations with them to determine whether there are other areas where it is appropriate.
Understood, but today was supposed to be about giving clarity for a whole bunch of industries, and already there seems to be some, inconsistencies. For example, gyms will be compulsory, hairdressers compulsory, but can you take me through things like pharmacists or supermarket workers?
Well, there is consistency here because we are putting this requirement alongside the COVID vaccine certificate. So it's about having absolute consistency that people in these workplaces, whether it's someone coming in for a drink in the evening or a meal, will be served by a worker who also has to be vaccinated. Now, the second part of today's announcements, if you'll let me get to that, I think does answer the other part of the question. Because what we have said for other workplaces is that we are going to also provide a clarified and simplified risk framework that will have very simple tests in it. Things like, do your workers interact with the public at close quarters, that businesses will be able to utilise to determine whether it's appropriate to require vaccination. So we're providing greater clarity for every other employer as well.
Just to come back to the taxis, though, for example, Minister, do you not have to show a COVID vaccine certificate to use a taxi?
No, that's not currently contemplated, but as I say, we're going to have a look at whether there should be further areas that should be mandated, and they will be businesses who can also use the simplified risk framework.
Right, because that's in the red zone on the traffic light framework that you've provided. Is that's somewhere that's going to be clarified?
Yeah, well, as I said today, businesses who use the COVID vaccine certificate are covered by this, and we'll be looking at other areas who should be potentially included as well.
Right. So with this new process, what happens if a worker refuses the mandated vaccine?
That's right. Well, what we're setting out today is that there'll have to be a good process and conversation between the employer and employee. We expect the employer and employee to work together for there to be encouragement and support for that person to get vaccinated. There'll be a right to paid time off that we're creating as well. But ultimately, if that worker determines that they're not going to get vaccinated, and the employer works through a process, looks at redeployment options, and they're not viable, there'll then be a 4-week countdown period. And that employee will have a final 4-week period to determine whether or not they're going to get vaccinated. And at the end of that period, their employment can be terminated.
So what legal advice have you sought around that if employers are starting that 4-week termination period, they're not going to open themselves up to legal action from employers or anyone else for that matter?
We've developed these proposals specifically in response to concerns that we've heard from the business community and others, that they feel that they want greater clarity and they want reduced legal risk. So the processes that we've put in place today, whether it's through the mandate or whether it's through a statutory risk framework, lift a lot of that risk away from employers by providing much greater clarity and direction from government.
Are you expecting legal challenges around this?
Well, look, I would never preclude the right of people to have their day in court, and we're not going to take away anyone's rights to do that. It's important that we retain those basic rights in our society. But overall, I expect that these changes will actually result in greater certainty and a lesser prospect of there being litigation around these issues. So, for example, in the case of the mandates we're putting in place today, which will cover about 25% of the workforce, they are mandates that the government has put in place. It is not a decision of the employer, and as long as the employer follows the basic consultative and good faith processes properly, there is minimal legal risk to them.
I am interested, Minister, in some of the industry's jobs where the government is the employer. For example, the police, and it's not mandatory yet there for people who are employed by the police to have mandatory vaccines. Is this not something the government should be leading by example with?
Well, it's important to note that many organisations are currently using the existing risk framework that's in place to assess whether work should be done by vaccinated workers only. What we're doing in this process, as I said, is creating a new framework that organisations like the police, whether they're public or private, could pick up and use. But we will consider other organisations and types of work, both public and private, as to whether it's appropriate that they be mandated as well. I think it's important to note that the steps that we've provided today are a very big step forward. It covers about 25% of the workforce, and we are indicating that we'll do further work in the coming weeks. But we will step through it carefully. We'll consult with employers, we'll consult with unions so that we get the policy right.
It is a big step forward, and it's into the private realm. So wouldn't it be fair for the government to get its own state employees vaccinated first to set that example and try and create more public safety?
Well, through the use of the orders over the course of this year, the government has done that. We've done that in critical public border workforces, we've done that in health, we've done that in education, places where we've identified that there is a higher risk and therefore a higher expectation of vaccination. So I would absolutely say that government has taken the lead there, and we will consider what steps are appropriate across the rest of the public sector workforce. But actually we shouldn't be necessarily treating the public sector and the private sector workforces differently. We should be managing the risk and having policy that's in the public interest. And this mix of the mandates for CVC workplaces and a clearer risk framework will apply to both public and private and give much greater confidence.
Does the government have any plans to mandate vaccines for all state sector employees?
We don't have any current plans to make a sweeping pronouncement like that, but as I've indicated, ministers will work together to identify whether there are any other areas which it's appropriate to have a vaccination mandate and expectation in place.
Could we expect that in places like work and income offices, the Defence Force, police? There's a whole raft of places where it would set a tone for the rest of the country if the government led.
Well, as I've said, the government has led with many of its key workforces. I'm not going to speculate. I'm just in the middle of an interview as to what workforces might come in. It's important we work these things through very carefully with the people who are involved, and we will undertake that work in the coming weeks.
Kia ora for your time. That was the Workplace Relations and Safety Minister Michael Wood joining us there on the new vaccine mandates for a whole raft of places today, and we'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Send me your feedback. Homai o whakaaro. What do you think about vaccine mandates for vaccine certificate businesses, and who else should a mandate cover? You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. A doctor says she'll have to leave the country and fly back in to be eligible for the government's one-off residence visa. Critical workers qualify if they arrive before next July, but those already here can only settle permanently if they were on certain visas at the end of last month. Jill Bonnet reports.
The 28-year-old doctor, who doesn't want to be named, arrived from Scotland in 2019 and worked at Wanganui Hospital. She went onto a working holiday visa to work as a locum in a different DHB.
This visa essentially allows me to locum in different hospitals, which the Essential Skills visa does not allow that flexibility for overseas doctors. And it's quite a well-trodden path. A lot of my colleagues applied for the same, a working holiday visa, because it gave them that flexibility.
It was a working holiday visa with no holiday attached, as she worked through the pandemic. And the visa leaves her out of the government's 160,000 new residents, despite her profession and salary. But she qualifies if she leaves the country and returns. She says it makes no sense to waste time and money on flights and managed isolation.
It would be possible to leave and come back on a critical purpose visa, but it's the time that's required off that's more the issue.
She says it's an unintended consequence of the new residence requirements.
I just think it's quite unfair, really, the way that the visa categories and how it's all being done very sort of haphazardly without really looking at the technicalities and things.
Those technicalities have tripped up other healthcare staff. And while she weighs up getting a return flight, others are buying a one-way ticket. A mental health support worker in the South Island, who also asked to remain anonymous, found his partnership work visa left him out of the residence scheme. He says it was the last straw and he's not coming back.
Every country needs mental health support workers. They are in very much demand around the globe. Some of the employees from the Canada interview me, and once they will proceed, I will definitely leave this country because our future is really uncertain here.
The father of two says the skilled migrant residence pathway could have new criteria and the same old delays when it reopens.
It's going to be 2.5 years. Expression of interest is not resumed. And again, as per the scenario, 26 months more to be files to be processed. So it's going to be 5 years. So I don't think so. Being a reliable father or a reliable partner, I can't wait 5 years to decide my career.
He says he's been helping people with their mental health problems during the pandemic, but being in limbo so long has left him struggling with his own.
RNZ asked Immigration New Zealand and the Immigration Minister, Chris Whāwhoi, whether eligibility for one-off residence could be extended so healthcare staff don't have to leave the country, but we haven't received a reply. It is 27 minutes past 5. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. The South Island streak of no COVID-19 community cases ended over the weekend, prompting discussions about how to reduce further spread. The unvaccinated person flew from Rotorua to Blenheim late last week before testing positive. Already there's been calls for travellers to the South Island to have a pre-departure test and to be vaccinated. Our reporter Tess Brunton has more.
So far, 3 contacts of the Blenheim cases have returned negative results and no one else has tested positive. But Marlborough accommodation provider Shane Ruffin says it's been a wake-up call after close to a year with no COVID in the South Island. He's already noticing the impact of the Blenheim case on his businesses. He offers about 250 beds to backpackers and RSE workers and was preparing for a boost over the Labour weekend.
No one's come into the region. We were actually quite gobsmacked that we had no contact, no calls or nothing to look for any accommodation at all, which previously, even though COVID's been around for quite some time now, we'd still have people making inquiries and things like that, whereas we just had nothing.
He thinks only allowing vaccinated people in could be a good idea.
I probably would support that because, the government have said 90% is the vaccination rate until things open up, and we can't really do a lot about that. If we can encourage anyone to get vaccinated, and if that means you can't travel to and from the South Island without a vaccination, we'd happily support that. We're not in a position to turn people away from our accommodation if they haven't been vaccinated because it's just revenue we can't find elsewhere.
The Mayor of Marlborough District, John Leggett, is pleased no further cases have been reported in his district.
There's sensible people out there that follow the rules. There's some that don't think it's going to affect them, don't think it's going to affect our community. And it's those people we really need to target to let them know in very clear terms this is a potential health crisis in our region, as it is right through the country. So being vigilant, following the rules, it's been a very good reminder for us locally here in Marlborough.
He's not so keen on travel to the South Island being restricted to only those vaccinated.
I've heard that from a few people. Vaccination itself, I'd prefer to see testing before they hopped on the plane if there was a way of achieving that. But look, we know how easily this is spread down through the North Island from the Auckland region, and it's made its way into the South Island with the case we've had here over the weekend. So there's always the potential for that to happen.
Carlin Top is the General Manager for Highview Apartments in Queenstown and Marina Terrace Accommodation in Wanaka. She hopes the Blenheim case will lead to more people getting vaccinated and less complacency in the South Island. Ms Top says vaccine mandates would be a nightmare logistically, but she could see it eventually being used for some domestic travel.
We need to look further afield at what we need to put in place to be able to open up to all of New Zealand to be able to carry on with life and start living with it in the community, but B, to be able to open up internationally again as well.
When asked if vaccination entry could be on the cards, COVID-19 Response Minister Chris Hipkins had a simple response.
We're not proposing to cut the South Island off from the rest of the country.
Any residents in Marlborough, Nelson and Tasman with symptoms are being asked to get tested.
That was Tess Brunton reporting. Kia ora e te iwi I haere aki nei I a Checkpoint grounded Kiwis on how they'd run home isolation. We speak to Business New Zealand about the government's new vaccine mandates, and the Black Caps prepare to roll the arm over as the T20 World Cup gets underway. All mai o whakaaro. Don't forget you can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Now it's time for the headlines with Sarah.
Thanks, Nita. Hospitality New Zealand says new rules requiring people working in certain businesses to be vaccinated will create a few stressful weeks for staff. People working in close contact businesses such as hospitality, events, gyms and hairdressing will have 4 weeks to get vaccinated or their employment can be terminated. Hospitality Chief Executive Julie White says the law will ease some of the bigger legal risks and the clarification is helpful. Under the new requirements, employers will also be required to provide paid time off for workers to get vaccinated and will need to keep records about their workers' vaccination status. Meanwhile, the latest COVID-19 daily update shows 89% of New Zealanders have now had their first dose of the Pfizer vaccine and 71% have had their second shot. There are 79 new community cases of the virus today, 75 in Auckland and 4 in Waikato. 33 cases have not yet been linked to the current outbreak. The former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark says the pandemic has led to extreme poverty worldwide. Speaking at New Zealand's Council for International Development's annual conference today, she outlined how COVID-19 vaccines need to be more readily available to avoid further humanitarian crises. An Auckland High School principal expects more senior students to return in the coming days. Just over half of the year 11 to 13 students at Onehunga High School went back to the classroom today. Principal Deirdre Shea says it's been a positive experience for them. She thinks more will go back to the classroom as they gain confidence. And 2 Southland mayors will tow vaccination caravans to small rural communities next week. Gore District Mayor Tracy Hicks, Southland District Mayor Gary Tong and staff from Southern Health will visit 20 areas in an effort to raise vaccination rates. And then they will return at the end of the month to ensure people get their second doses. Those are the headlines. Our next news and sport update is at 6.
Thanks, Sarah. Farmers around the country could be in to reap the rewards of one of Fonterra's biggest milk price payouts in the cooperative's history. The dairy giant predicts an $8.40 payout would pour almost $13 billion into the regions. Here's our reporter Tom Kitchen.
On the windy hills of rural Hawke's Bay, looking out over the massive green fields below the Kāwika Ranges, dairy farmer Nick Dawson attends to his cows. The sun and heat have certainly come out in spades today, and there's good feelings in the air.
No, we're ecstatic. I mean, it's a great payout, no doubt about that. We only bought our farm 2 years ago, so we're carrying a lot of debt. So for us, this is magic.
Fonterra is owned by New Zealand farmers, and today the company forecasted it'd be paying farmers a record payment for milk solids. This matches the record of the 2013-14 season. Fonterra says this will see almost $13 billion flow into regional New Zealand. Nick Dawson is deep in the heart of regional Aotearoa and says it's welcome news after a tough couple of seasons with big droughts in Hawke's Bay.
The cost structure of our business has gone through the roof, and the droughts have just hammered that as well. Cost a lot of money, had to destock early, basically didn't make any profit.
Hauraki District Mayor Toby Adams says his region has suffered from a lack of tourism during the pandemic, and a good dairy payout would be a ray of light. He says it will help farmers to keep their staff, and everyone benefits when people are spending more in town.
So having a dairy sector or an agricultural sector having a bit of a boost sort of paints a good picture for retail up our main streets and keeps our jobs and our hopes alive.
Fonterra's Chief Financial Officer Mark Rivers says it's seeing the results of strong demand for dairy products coupled with limited supply.
Really, this is on the back of just continued strength in that demand picture that's out there, which gives us that confidence. We're a bit further in the season, and so we've got more of our milk is contracted, so that gives us more confidence to narrow the range. But it's been really pleasing to see, even as China demand has eased, to see other markets step in as they've done. So that's given us the confidence to go out with a lift in the forecast today.
But it may not be all shining news. ACT leader David Seymour sees a possible hike in tax from this payout by the government.
Oh, the farmers will bank the benefits of this white gold that they've just pulled out. But my question is this, why are farmers constantly under attack from every aspect of government policy, an avalanche of hostile regulation, as many farmers put it, when this is more evidence that if it was not for strong agricultural returns, New Zealand's economy would be in big trouble through COVID.
And Fonterra says it's still early in the season and a lot can change. They're keeping an eye on COVID-19 disruptions, inflation, exchange rates, weather and politics.
Well, staying with all things business now, we are joined by Nona Peltier, who's in our Auckland newsroom. Tēnā koe, Nona. The Reserve Bank says climate change poses a significant challenge to New Zealand's financial stability. What's it actually doing about it?
Well, it's got an action plan, and they've decided that the number one thing they're going to do is get their own house in order. So amongst those things is basically including how much emissions are embedded in purchased goods and services. They're going to add that to their understanding of how much they're using as carbon. And they're also going to do more to interact with the rest of, I guess, the sector, the financial sector, on how they can, do more as well. And they're going to take part in a global network with 95 other central banks to see how they can do more collectively to address some of the issues that are ahead of them.
And the two big supermarket chains, they're ready to sign up to an industry-wide cost of conduct, but are pushing back on what might be included. What's their concern?
Well, as our listeners may know, the Commerce Commission has been holding a seminar. There's, I guess, 10 sessions coming up. Well, we're in session number 3 today. And what we had today was one looking at grocery code of conduct, not surprisingly. And the supermarket chains have said, well, they're ready to sign up to one, but they don't want it to include something like collective bargaining mechanism for food suppliers, because the wholesalers have been complaining that because of the duopoly of Woolworths and foodstuffs, that they're at a disadvantage in terms of how their pricing works, or even getting their products onto a store shelf. So the supermarkets are saying there's no need for that. We would like not to have that. Thank you very much. But look, the review is going on, so it's early days still.
Watch this space. Hey, Nona, thanks for that. Do you have a market update for us, please?
I do. I just wanted to say that the Fonterra share price dropped a little bit on that high price, wholesale milk price. And that's partly because it's going to make their ingredients cost more and cut into their profits at the other end of the market. So anyways, our top 50 index, it was actually little change. We were down just 18 points to 13,075. And the New Zealand dollar, it's also little change. We're trading at 71.7 US cents, 95.5 Australian, and 52.1 pence.
Nona, thank you as always. That was our business reporter, Nona Peltier, with that update there. Heading overseas now, a group of New Zealanders stuck overseas have proposed a self-isolation system for returnees, which would see more people get home and reduce the costs for the government. The Grounded Kiwis plan would take into account the vaccine status of the people returning and where they've come from, as well as the vaccine rates in New Zealand. Grounded Kiwi spokesperson Martin Newell joins us now from Melbourne. Kia ora, Martin. Could you just take us through exactly how this will work? How are people going to keep safe and be able to come home?
Kia ora, Nita. Thanks for getting in touch. Yeah, so the proposal is split into two phases. They are linked to vaccination levels in New Zealand, most importantly, which is the key metric to keeping New Zealanders safe. And it also applies a risk profile to all returnees. So you can be coming from a low risk, a medium risk, or a high risk country. So phase one, which could be implemented immediately, is fully vaccinated returnees from low-risk locations. For example, a country like Singapore will be allowed to isolate for 5 days at home and would have to complete a pre-departure test, a test on arrival, and a test on day 4 before they will be able to be released. Fully vaccinated returnees from medium-risk locations would isolate for 10 days with regular testing, and high-risk returnees would go into a mandatory 14-day MIQ isolation. Once New Zealand reaches 80% of the 12-plus population is fully vaccinated, the second phase of the proposed system would come into effect, and self-isolation would not be required for low-risk returnees. So, for example, if you're travelling from Sydney to Auckland, you could skip isolation altogether, provided you had a negative pre-departure PCR test and an on-arrival test. Self-isolation will be available for all other returnees, depending on their risk level. That would depend on how long that period of isolation would be.
So you mentioned Singapore in there. What are some of those other risk levels? What would be a high risk? We've got New South Wales versus Victoria at the moment. How would everyone fit into those different frameworks?
Well, if you look at Auckland and what's happening in New South Wales, you've got more or less the same kind of a case count. So you've got just as much risk of catching, if not more, risk of catching COVID in Auckland than if you will be coming from Sydney. So actually, because of the vaccination rates in New South Wales and very soon the vaccination rate in Victoria, they would be treated as standalone countries. So New South Wales would be low risk at the moment. Victoria would be a medium risk country if it were its own country in Australia, but that would become a low risk country as the vaccination level and the cases here in Melbourne continue to decline.
Right, and some logistics, if you will. Self-isolation requirements. What about the movements of other people at the property?
Yeah, so depending on where you isolate, if the property that you are self-isolating in, if there's not a separate part of the house which you can use exclusively, then all of the people within that house need to become part of your bubble and they need to isolate with you. So you need to stay on the property. You're not allowed to go out to get essential services. You'd have to only do deliveries and click and collect and contactless only. If the property that you're isolating at has its own, say, a cabin in the back garden, then you can isolate, but you're not allowed to come into contact with any of the members of the rest of that household. You need to be completely separate from them. And under the first phase of our plan, we have a restriction on the distance from Auckland that you are able, or Christchurch that you are able to isolate from. So you wouldn't be able to, say, fly into Auckland and then jump on a regular domestic flight and then fly off down to Dunedin. Under phase one, you'd have to be 150 kilometres by road from Auckland or Christchurch airport.
Right, so you, under that, would get picked up at the airport, and what's the logistics of actually getting to your location?
You have to drive without stopping, and that person would have to isolate.
And does the property have to be approved, like 150 kilometres and meeting requirements? Who's checking this stuff?
The property needs to be, it could be the returnee's home, it could be another person's home, it could be rental or standalone accommodation, including Airbnb. It must have reliable cell phone coverage, and you would have to be subjected to random calls from the Ministry of Health to check that you are isolating, and there would be some form of a digital tracker. So some jurisdictions, like in Hong Kong, they give you a bracelet that you wear that tracks your movement, so you wouldn't be allowed to move off that property without triggering an alert to health authorities.
I'm with you. How would you feel about home isolation, but only in Auckland? That's where our outbreak is, and that's where a lot of people are flying into. How would that sit with you?
Well, for us, I think that's why we've put in the vaccination thresholds, as the government has with the traffic light system. At this stage, until New Zealand gets to a higher level of vaccination rate, it's not reasonable to expect that Kiwis could just jump on a domestic flight and then travel to somewhere else in the country. So although it would impact a lot of New Zealanders overseas that perhaps live in the South Island or perhaps live in other parts of the North Island, isolating in Auckland, to be fair, for a lot of people, there's more risk of catching COVID once you leave your isolation anyway, and stepping outside. Yep.
Martin, thank you so much for your time. We're going to have to leave it there. That was Grounded Kiwi spokesperson Martin Newell joining us from Melbourne with their proposal about how home isolation could work in New Zealand as we shift away from the MIQ model. It is 5:45. 5:45. I'm Nita Blake-Persen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. After the news at 6, we'll have Business New Zealand on the expanded vaccine mandate for workers. But now, whānau ora providers have told the High Court that the Health Ministry's refusal to hand over the vaccination information of all Māori is inconsistent and a breach of the Treaty of Waitangi. But the Crown says to do so would be a serious breach of privacy and could actually derail the vaccination rollout for Māori. Our Māori news reporter Jamie Tahana has been following today's proceedings and joins us now. Tēnā koe, Jamie. Can you remind us what this whole case is all about?
Yeah, so whānau ora providers are, the Māori organisations on the ground providing vaccines in the Māori communities, trying to boost that rate. They want data for all Māori held by the Health Ministry, so that includes the likes of phone numbers and addresses, so they can, they say, tailor vaccination programs to boost Māori rates, phone calls or mobile clinics and the like. Of course, Māori are fast becoming the worst affected by the Delta outbreak, more than half of all new cases and rapidly rising. And Māori are still well behind in the rollout, some 20% back. The Health Ministry, though, will only release some data, that of people who are registered with or who have used a whānau ora provider before. It's also agreed to release other data, but that would be anonymised. The Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency, it's been called Waka in court all day, says this will be largely useless to it if it's going to get to the really hard-to-reach communities, which, as we're getting late in the program, is becoming, the main group.
So Waka, that commissioning agency, what did they tell the court today?
Its lawyers argued the data would greatly improve targeted vaccination programs and would help it reach those largely Maori communities that are proving hard to access. They said, as it's just said, it would involve phone calls by people who engaged with these communities on a day-to-day basis. And with the spread of the Delta outbreak, they said such a targeted approach is needed now, with the disparity becoming quite stark. On the data, one of its most significant points was that the Health Ministry has given the same information it's asking for to Healthline for its outreach campaigns. It also gives whānau ora providers access to data for other campaigns, like those who've missed measles, mumps and rubella vaccines. They argued these are a glaring inconsistency.
How did that go down? What did the Crown say?
Well, the Crown argued that releasing Māori data would be a breach of privacy. It's reluctant to release such data. It said it was taking a wait-and-see approach, and vaccination rates for Māori are improving without it. There were 140,000 Māori who've had a jab since the challenge was filed. They said they'd only release the data as a last resort if they really hit a wall, although when asked what that point might be, they said they didn't have one. The Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency, of course, argued this was akin to allowing the issue to percolate when the need to vaccinate is now. The Crown also said it was concerned that releasing the data could further undermine efforts in a community that's already sceptical of the state. That would just add to the distrust.
A bit of discussion around the treaty and tikanga today?
Yeah, they were both invoked quite substantially from both the Crown and the Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency. The agency argued that there's an obligation to facilitate a kaupapa Māori program and to ensure equitable outcomes. Tino Rangatiratanga provides that Māori providers should be fulfilled and given full access without obstacle. There was no dispute that the Crown had an obligation under the treaty as an overarching principle, but there was discussion about how it's implied in this instance.
So what actually happens now, Jamie?
Justice Gwynne reserved her decision but noted the urgency needed for one to be released. She wouldn't put a number of days but said a decision would be out as soon as possible.
Kia ora, Jamie. That was Jamie Tahana with that update today on the court case with the Whānau Ora Commissioning Agency trying to get some vaccine data from the Crown. No doubt we'll have more updates on those throughout the coming days. South Auckland community leaders are confident all 3 DHBs in Tamaki Makaurau will hit 90% fully vaccinated. And while the race is on to get the super city out of lockdown before Christmas, leaders say it's going to take a lot of work to reach those pockets of the community that have still not received a jab. Kate Gregan reports.
On the face of it, the numbers are good. 90% of eligible Aucklanders have received at least one dose and 77% are fully inoculated. But progress is slowing, and just 74% of those in Counties Manukau are double-dosed. Despite this, Manukau councillor Efeso Collins says the target's within reach.
We've got people who are really opening up now. We're not dealing to hesitancy as much these days. It's more logistics. Is there a car available? Do I have the time to get there? Can I get time off work?
His views are echoed by South Seas Healthcare Chief Executive Silau Vaisalasefu, who runs the Otara Vaccination and Testing Centre.
I'm confident we'll get there, but it's just not fast enough.
He says it's getting harder to reach the unvaccinated, and the vaccine strategy now needs to change.
Now we've got to change the approach. It's a lot more around events, social service, the non-medical approach, and I think that has to be at the forefront of our approach to really working with the last 15%.
While vaccination rates have slowed down, a steady stream of people are still rocking up and rolling up their sleeves. At the drive-through vaccine centre today, Sina got her first dose.
I've just had no reason to come and get it really, because all I do is stay home and look after my 2 children, so I don't travel anywhere, I don't go anywhere. It was just a personal choice for me, but my mum was enforcing me to get it, so that was the whole reason why I came today and got it. Yeah.
Bryce was there for his second, but delayed getting the first.
I knew I was going to do it, but I just have a fear of injections.
So what made you go out and get one?
I just compare the stats. It's like the stats are so small for adverse reactions compared to the negative effects that you get from COVID.
In another car was Michaela and 4 of her family members. She's a nurse and is fully vaxxed, but 2 people in her vehicle were getting their first dose.
Because I go out there and work in the front line, so I want them to be protected as well. So that's what they want to do as well, just to, I think, protect ourselves and other people who are near to us, like our family and our friends. Yeah.
Another local, Aaron, wasn't yet due for his second, but brought his friend along to get his first shot. He wants other people to do the same for their hesitant friends.
We don't want to be locked up like this forever, You've got to be able to get back to some sort of normality. So I think as soon as everybody gets a second jab, it'll be, all go, full steam ahead, back to normal.
Tamaki Makaurau will move to the new alert level system once all 3 DHBs hit 90% double dosed. Efeso Collins says that should be the bare minimum and hopes people can be patient while efforts are made to boost vaccine rates.
I understand people's irritation at the moment. I know my own family are struggling through this lockdown too. We're all lockdown fatigued at the moment. But we've got to get everybody to at least the 90%. We know that vulnerable Maori Pacific youth communities are often the groups that lag behind, and what we've got to do is send a clear message to them and say, we are holding up this boat, we're holding up this waka so that you can be on it because you're a part of our whānau.
Silao Vaisalasefu says his staff are doing everything they can to boost numbers and are mentally fatigued. But now is not the time to slow down.
Everyone's had it tough in the last 10 weeks, so a big shout out to all our community providers and also our churches, sports clubs. We've got a long way to go though, so it's not going to get any easier.
Less than 5,000 doses were administered in Auckland yesterday. 1,400 were first doses.
The human rights agency Amnesty International is closing its office in Hong Kong and moving staff out of the city. The group says Hong Kong's national security law makes it too dangerous there. The ABC's Bill Birtles has more.
Week in, week out, Hong Kong's political purge rolls on. A 20-year-old man on Monday became the second person to be convicted under a sweeping security law that has transformed the city. He'll face at least 3 years in jail for chanting slogans in support of Hong Kong independence. And there are dozens more awaiting trial for other political crimes. Against this backdrop, Amnesty International has decided to pack its bags and flee the city. A statement from the chair of Amnesty's board, Anjula Maya Singh Bias, said,
Hong Kong's national security law has made it effectively impossible for human rights organisations to work freely and without fear of serious reprisals from the government.
She went on to say authorities there are stepping up a campaign to rid the city of all dissenting voices. Patrick Poon used to work for Amnesty in Hong Kong but left due to the national security law. He's now a human rights researcher in the relative safety of London.
Since the NSL was passed last year, a number of organisations have no choice either to close their organisation or they have to become silent on political and human rights issues.
Amnesty is the third international rights NGO to leave Hong Kong due to the political changes. China's government is one by one picking off local opposition groups, using public warnings and police pressure. A council of trade unions, a teachers' association and several pro-democracy groups have recently disbanded due to the threat of arrest. The city's Journalists Association is currently being named and pressured by security officials and the government media outlets as the next likely target. As China and now Hong Kong increasingly closes off to the world, Patrick Poon says it's getting harder to find out what's going on there.
It's getting much more and more difficult to do face-and-face interviews. Researchers definitely face a lot of pressure. So it's getting much more difficult.
That report by Bill Birtles. A fired-up and informed opposition awaits the Black Caps in their opening match at cricket's T20 World Cup. New Zealand starts their campaign against Pakistan in Sharjah early tomorrow morning. Clay Wilson reports.
Tomorrow's match comes hot on the heels of Pakistan's historic win over arch-rivals India at the weekend, and is also set against the backdrop of the Black Caps' controversial abandonment of their tour to Pakistan last month. The withdrawal drew an angry response from Pakistan fans, players and officials, with Pakistan cricket chairman Ramiz Raja saying tomorrow's match was a chance for vengeance. But New Zealand captain Kane Williamson is playing down the potential for any kind of animosity.
There are also a lot of good relations within the two teams over the years. We've played a lot against each other, and a number of players have played with each other as well. So I'm sure it'll be played in the right spirit.
The Black Caps, though, are still expecting a highly competitive clash. Coach Gary Stead says they'll need to play close to their best to beat a Pakistan side flying high after their thumping win over pre-tournament favourites India.
They're a very passionate nation. They play with their heart on their sleeve, and sometimes I think you just have to weather the storm for a while, and hopefully if you stay in the contest for long enough, you then provide you with options at different times during the game that you can put them back under pressure again, and then I guess that will be our challenge.
Stead says the Pakistan players aren't the only factor the New Zealanders must overcome if they're to start the tournament with a win.
I'm predicting there'll be 95% Pakistan fans at the game. Here in the UA, strongly, I guess, favouring the Pakistani fans, and also they've played here a lot in the last 8 to 10 years, so they certainly have a strong fan base here, and hopefully we can stand up and show our fight as well.
Williamson is hoping to lead the way in that regard, and the Black Cap skipper says he's ready to go despite his struggles with an elbow injury.
It's just been an ongoing sort of challenge to deal with it regarding loading and these sorts of things, so it's just a work in progress, but I think all in all it's showing improvement.
Tomorrow morning's match in Sharjah is set to start at 3 o'clock.
Right, we have some time now for some feedback just before the news at 6. Most of it on vaccine mandates. The big news today around more mandatory vaccinations for people with vaccine certificates required. Some of this vaccine certificate should be mandated for clubs such as bridge, snooker, indoor bowls, etc., which tend to have older players. This person says, I am a teacher and fully vaccinated, which I chose to do. I am very curious as to why police are not part of the mandated workforce when clearly they work very closely with the public. It makes no sense. This person, the more protection, the better. Another, will there be further announcement for general retail? My employer is indicating they will not be using vaccine certificates for customers. I'm double vax, but don't feel sure of how that environment will operate at the traffic light levels.
RNZ News at 6. Good evening, I'm Sarah Bradley. Unvaccinated workers employed by businesses that require customers to present a vaccine certificate will have 4 weeks to get inoculated when a sweeping mandate comes into force. If they do not, their employment will be terminated. Cabinet has agreed to the major expansion of its vaccine mandate, which will come into force when the country moves to the new traffic light framework. Workplace Relations and Safety Minister Michael Wood says a new law will be introduced creating a 4-week notice period.
Once the notice period commences, the employee will have that amount of time to get vaccinated. Provided it is reasonable to do so, the employee will be able to retain their employment if they get vaccinated in that period, but their employment will be terminated if they do not.
The government is requiring employers to give their staff paid time off to get vaccinated and must also keep a record of their workers' vaccination status. Taxi drivers and people who work for rideshare services, however, will not have to comply with the new vaccination mandate for now. Mr Wood, however, has told Checkpoint that taxis and rideshare services are not covered by the COVID vaccine certificate rules, so the mandate does not apply. But he says ministers will consider whether there are other areas that should fall under the requirements. Hospitality New Zealand says while the newly announced vaccine mandate resolves some concerns, there is more detail to work out. Chief Executive Julie White says the law will ease some of the bigger legal risks and the clarification is helpful. But she says it will create a stressful few weeks for hospitality staff and employers in an industry already on a knife edge. An Auckland principal says they didn't feel safe to reopen their school with a vaccination rate of just 23%. Senior secondary school students in Alert Level 3 areas returned to the classroom today for the first time in more than 2 months. But Kia Ora College principal Hayley Milne says their vaccination rates made it unsafe to open the gates again.
It was a real concern for us about whether or not we were prioritising education and jeopardising people's health.
Hayley Milne says in the last 7 weeks, 50% of the locations of interest in Auckland have been within a 5-kilometre radius of their school in Mararewa. The Prime Minister is defending her decision not to travel to Auckland since the start of the Delta outbreak. Jacinda Ardern would need to isolate in Wellington for 5 days and test negative before returning to Parliament if she travelled to the region. Ms Ardern says she has done everything she can to understand the pressure Aucklanders are facing, and she empathises with them.
I have family there, I have friends there, but also I have a duty to run the country, and the rules that are set for this place at the moment mean that it would be hard for me to visit without then keeping me away from this place for a set period of time.
Jacinda Ardern says she is thinking of ways she can travel to Auckland safely in future. A Northland community leader is describing a planned march to Waitangi tomorrow as a scam run by Pākehā anti-vaxxers. Some of the group is threatening to breach Auckland's northern and southern borders to protest against the government's COVID strategy. Hone Harawera, who runs Te Tai Tōkero border control, says they have not been invited to the north and are not welcome. He says if they want to criticise the government's actions, they should go to Wellington. A Hawke's Bay farmer says a record forecast payout from Fonterra comes after a tough couple of years. The dairy giant expects an $8.40 payout would pour almost $13 billion into the regions. Hawke's Bay dairy farmer Nick Dawson from Pātoka says it's welcome news after a few seasons in drought.
No, we're ecstatic. I mean, it's a great payout, no doubt about that. We only bought our farm 2 years ago, so we're carrying a lot of debt. So for us, this is magic.
Rural mayors say everyone benefits from the payment when people are spending more in small towns. Crown Casino will be allowed to keep operating in Melbourne despite a Victorian Royal Commission finding illegal and unethical behaviour by the Australian gaming giant. The ABC's Richard Willingham is in Melbourne.
The long-awaited final report tabled to State Parliament describes the casino's conduct as dishonest, unethical and exploitative. It stopped short of revoking Crown's lucrative licence to run Victoria's sole casino. Instead, a special manager will be appointed to oversee the casino's operations. The Commission said it could have easily ripped up the licence, but noted the efforts of Crown to reform. There will also be limits placed on how big a stake shareholders can have in the company to reduce undue influence, with the Royal Commission critical of the role of James Packer's company CPH. The government has accepted all the recommendations.
To sport, and the Black Caps coach Gary Stead isn't expecting much crowd support when they play Pakistan in their opening T20 World Cup game in Sharjah tomorrow morning. The New Zealanders can expect an icy reception in the heat of the UAE after abandoning their recent tour of Pakistan due to security concerns. Pakistan are coming off an emphatic 10-wicket win over India in their tournament opener, and Stead is certain the majority of those at the ground won't be supporting the Black Caps.
I'm predicting there'll be 95% Pakistan fans at the game. Here in the UAE, strongly, favouring the Pakistani fans, and also they've played here a lot in the last 8 to 10 years. So they certainly have a strong fan base here, and hopefully we can stand up and show our fight as well.
The game starts at 3 a.m. The All Blacks loose forward Sam Cane says he's not yet up to playing top-level rugby. Cane came off the bench in the weekend's romp over the United States in Washington after a long injury layoff. He says he's going to have to work hard to get the starting open-side position and captaincy back, and he hopes to just get some game time in the next 4 tests in Europe. Football Ferns coach Jitka Klimklava is set to make wholesale changes to her side for their second game against the Olympic champions Canada tomorrow. New Zealand lost 5-1 to Canada at the weekend, and Klimklava is blaming the side's defensive blunders for the heavy loss. The game in Montreal kicks off at 12:30 tomorrow afternoon. And that's the news.
This week on Nights, Gay Buckingham on her historical novel The Kakapo Keeper, based on the lives of Fiordland's pioneer conservationists and the birds they tried to save. Harry McNaughton talks about The Pact, a family drama about euthanasia. And speaking of family, there's a new podcast documentary, Let's Be Transparent, a story of gender transition as told by Joseph Stockhausen and his mum, Pauline, on Nights with me, Brian Crump, weeknights from 7 on RNZ National.
And we are funded through New Zealand On Air. Now it's time for the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Western areas from Northland to Wellington, mainly fine today with just a few showers about the hills. Scattered rain at times tomorrow. Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupō, mostly cloudy with patchy light rain or drizzle, but fine breaks this afternoon. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa, mainly fine, high cloud tomorrow, a few afternoon and evening showers in southern Hawke's Bay and the Tararua district. For Nelson and Marlborough, cloudy periods, rain this evening in Nelson and inland Marlborough. Buller, Westland and Fiordland, occasional rain easing to a few showers this afternoon, then clearing. Fine spells tomorrow, but showers return in southern Westland from afternoon. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, low cloud or fog morning and night, a few showers mainly afternoon and evening, with isolated thunderstorms and hail from southern Canterbury to Southland. And at the Chatham Islands, cloudy with occasional drizzle. This is RNZ National. It's 8 minutes past 6. We'll have news headlines at 6:30.
Thanks, Sarah. No mai hoki mai. Well, no job, no jab, no job, rather, is about to become a reality for tens of thousands of people. The government's expanded the vaccine mandate to cover all workers at businesses where customers will need to show a COVID vaccine certificate. That includes cafes, restaurants, gyms and close contacts businesses like hairdressers. Those that aren't vaccinated will be given a 4-week notice period to get their shots before employment can be terminated. For more on this, we're joined now by Business New Zealand CEO Kirk Hope. Kia ora, Kirk. Thanks for being with us. Now, you've been involved with consultations on this, I understand. Can you give us a bit of a feel on how businesses are sounding you
Sure, yeah. I mean, the genesis of this was really occurred probably 6 weeks ago, and sort of got a head of steam up. We, alongside the CTU, approached the government and said, look, this is a real challenge. Employers and neither employers nor employees have real clarity around what their rights and obligations are in the workplace around vaccination, and we need more clarity. They sort of worked with us, or we worked with them. They put the policy together pretty quickly in 3 weeks really, and now we've got a lot we've got a lot greater clarity, I think, and certainty for employers. I think it's also important. You just outlined a range of businesses where workers will need to be vaccinated, and that's those covered, those businesses that are covered by CVCs. There's also an additional process that businesses can go through, which is a risk assessment process, which will be underpinned by law, a simplified risk assessment process, which can essentially enable them to assess whether they need to have a vaccinated workforce or not. And then, because it's underpinned by law, that will provide further vaccine mandates for employers and provide clarity for employees around, safety and health and safety in the workplace.
So that's for businesses who maybe haven't heard their, industry or whatever come up today, but they think this would be quite useful for us to take a look at. That's how that will be targeted towards them?
Yeah, that's right. So they may not be organisations or sectors which are covered by the CVC process or the COVID vaccination certificate process, or covered by a public health order, but where it was felt that it was necessary to give certainly employers a legal platform to be able to take steps to mandate vaccination in their workforce because of the risks that they were seeing in the workplace, and that's why the risk assessment, the simplified risk assessment, is really important.
So it makes the whole thing quite broad. Do you think it's too much, or there's any overreach here?
Not at all. I mean, we've got a choice here, vaccination or lockdowns, and I know what I prefer. So, I mean, the reality is we regulate, people's behaviour is regulated and even in health is regulated in different ways all of the time. So, I mean, I think if you think about smoking in bars, for example, that was shut down years ago, regulated. So people's behaviour is changed as a result of rules, and I think this is a situation where we're actually getting vaccinated is doing the right thing. It's kind of looking after your whānau, it's looking after your community, and it enables business to carry on and people to continue to earn a living.
So what feedback have you had from businesses so far?
Overwhelmingly positive. Look, there'll be businesses out there who don't want to mandate vaccination for their workforce, and I think that will be their choice, but they should at least go through the risk assessment process to determine that first.
You wouldn't anticipate that there'd be too much legal blowback then if everyone's sounding quite on board?
Well, I think the legal blowback really is taken away when this process is legislated. So, and I think that was the important step that wasn't there before. That's why employers can have certainty around taking the step to mandate vaccination in their workforce if they see the risk.
Do you have any estimates based on this, the further extension today, how many people may lose their jobs as a result of this?
Well, people are only going to lose their job if they choose not to get vaccinated. There are very, very few people who cannot get medically vaccinated using the Pfizer vaccine in New Zealand. So if people choose not to get vaccinated, and we're seeing quite high vaccination rates starting to pick up in Auckland, for example. I think 93% of the population is first dose and 81% is second dose. So we're actually talking about smaller and smaller numbers of people. And I guess, again, if people were not necessarily hesitant, they're just taking their time a bit, this is a way to help them to understand that it's really important that they do get vaccinated because it will be required for them to do many, many things.
And obviously this risk assessment framework is there to expand it, but at first glance, does it seem like the government's targeting the right sectors and the right businesses here?
Well, that's certainly for mandating from a government perspective, and I think so. Where there's obviously high risk, where you've got a lot of people because Delta is so transmissible. But I mean, it will affect even affects offices and workplaces because you're using recycled air, and that's another risk in terms of transmission of Delta. So there are very few workplaces that won't be touched by Delta or the risk of Delta, in my view.
Kia ora, Kirk. Hey, thanks so much for your time. That's Kirk Hope, the Business New Zealand CEO there, discussing those latest vaccine mandates. Mental health experts say the devil will be in the detail of the government's long-term pathway to mental wellbeing, kia manawa nui. But the nitty-gritty seems to be missing from the document, and experts warn little will change unless the plan's developed. Here's reporter Kim Moody.
The 10-year plan released last month aims to tackle the causes of mental distress in Aotearoa. It's part of the government's wider response to the He Ara Oranga inquiry back in 2018, with an oversight group set to monitor its performance. Mental Health Foundation Chief Executive Sean Robinson says Kia Manawa Nui is the first step.
He Ara Oranga is the name of the story. Kia Manawa Nui is another chapter, but it's part of that same story. And the big story is the thing that gives me hope. Kia Manawa Nui being back on track with that, gives me hope. But the next thing is we need to see it put into practice.
It sets out short, medium and long-term actions for the government to take, but it's been criticised for not including milestones to meet. The Foundation suggested a rolling action plan set every 2 years with clear aims such as boosting the availability of services and staff numbers.
I think we should be saying, OK, homelessness is a major issue. We've just seen a good, hopeful policy change about addressing housing issues in New Zealand. We need to draw the links with justice. Mental health issues within the prison system are huge. So let's actually say, what is being done in that prison system to address the issues.
Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission Chair Hayden Wano says instead of setting targets, an action plan could be formed by working backwards from an end goal.
Let's get a good process going around how we could define and describe what success could look like would be a good starting point. And then working back from that point and saying, well, over what time period can we achieve something and what would we put in place to determine when we're on track or not. And then in that process, also define who's responsible for doing what.
And how will we know if the mahi's making a difference?
Let's talk to the people. Let's talk to the people who have lived experience, to the whānau, to people on the front line, and use those forums to be able to describe what success looks like.
Sean Robinson says success will show in the level of well-being in the community, which is very different to the level of mental illness.
For my well-being, as someone living with bipolar, if I could not get access to medications or to specialist health services when I need them, or to counselling or therapy at times when I need them, that would definitely undermine my well-being. but also if I couldn't work, if I wasn't able to find a job, and if I didn't have enough money to keep a roof over my head and food on my table and a reasonable level of participation in the community for me and my whānau, that would undermine my well-being.
Director of Social Work at the University of Auckland, Dr. Barbara Staniforth, warns all political parties need to be on board to tackle the challenges that will take generations to overcome.
We need to start together at the formation stages. We can't just rely on a policy being put forward that's linked just to one party, that's been developed exclusively by one party, that we know by virtue of that having gone that way, that the other parties are going to oppose it. So we really need to see governments working together and parties working together right from the beginning.
An external oversight group will monitor the government's performance, and advocates are keeping a close eye on its next steps. Sean Robinson says the public are demanding change.
The people of New Zealand are not going to let this issue go away. There is far too much concern about it, and any politician that chooses to ignore mental health now would do so at their peril. They would be absolutely destroyed at the ballot box.
Health Minister Andrew Little has said the mental health system was neglected under the national government, and fixing it is a massive task.
It is 18 and a half minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The most important meeting of the year for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations gets underway today, but Myanmar's top general has been excluded, the first time a leader has been shut out. The ABC's Marzoe Ford reports.
One of the bedrock principles of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is not to interfere in each other's domestic affairs. But 8 months on from the Myanmar coup, ASEAN is doing just that. The bloc's annual summit begins today, and Myanmar's military leader, Min Aung Hlaing, isn't invited.
It's unprecedented. I mean, this is the first time that ASEAN collectively has made any effort of sorts to set criteria or conditions on who can attend.
Mo Thuzar is co-coordinator of the Myanmar Studies Program at the Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. She says ASEAN's reacting to the junta's refusal to allow a special envoy to visit, to accept humanitarian aid, and most importantly, to end the violence.
It's significant because it does reflect, I think, that there is this unease among the 9 other ASEAN member states on the status and the representation of Senior General Min Aung Hlaing.
Former Australian Ambassador to Myanmar, Nicholas Koppel, says ASEAN's principle of not interfering in the affairs of member nations doesn't trump other goals, such as protecting human rights.
This is the first real test of ASEAN, or indeed the first time ASEAN has risen to the occasion and decided that enough is enough and that it will address an internal issue in a member state, an internal issue which is affecting ASEAN's credibility and the perceptions of ASEAN. I think Min Aung Hlaing thought he could take ASEAN for granted, thought he could play them. I think the fact that he is not going to be at the Special Leaders Summit is a very personal affront to him.
Burmese democracy activist Tinza Shunlei was disappointed earlier in the year when ASEAN did invite Min Aung Hlaing to a meeting because she felt the bloc was giving him legitimacy. Now she's pleased to see a change of approach.
The ASEAN itself is formed with different types of government, mostly authoritarian. So when these leaders make such bold decision, that totally hurt the junta leader, because junta leader never thought ASEAN would dare to do such decision for him. So that's so significant.
The junta said it strongly objects to being excluded from the summit, but would endeavour to find a peaceful solution based on the ASEAN spirit. Democracy activist Tinza Shunlei says don't be fooled.
All the fake promises without actual action, without actual commitment is nothing to us.
The UK and Australia continue to cosy up to one another, with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson describing Australia's 2050 climate pledge as heroic. But Mr Johnson is also worried the UN climate talks in Glasgow next week may end in failure. Here's the ABC's Nick Dole.
You want to go here or here? Where am I supposed to go? Oh, down here. Okay, come on. Hello, everybody.
Boris Johnson wanders into his press briefing room for a grilling, not from reporters this time, but from school children who all had questions about the environment.
I'm from Scotland. Do you think world leaders are listening to us, and do you think COP26 will make a difference?
The Prime Minister told his interrogator, Lucas, that he was encouraged by the number of countries signing on to a target of net zero emissions by 2050.
I think the Australians have just decided to do that. Now, that was actually very difficult for Australia because Australia is very heavily dependent on coal, on lots of carbon producing industries, and they've done a heroic thing.
The 2050 deal might have been hard won in the coalition party room, but when Scott Morrison arrives in Glasgow, he'll still be under pressure to do more, like commit to ambitious 2030 targets. Ahead of the COP26 summit, the UN Development Programme and Oxford University have been trying to gauge the public mood around the world. Their survey found Australians are among the most strident in their desire to see action on climate change. Professor Stephen Fisher from Oxford said that view was even more pronounced among young people.
It was particularly striking that Australian under-18s were the highest in the G20 in their demand for climate action and also in terms of thinking of climate change as a global emergency, with fully 82% of under-18s saying that that's what they thought of climate change.
Despite emissions dropping due to COVID-19, the UN has warned that greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have reached record levels. Petteri Tallis from the World Meteorological Organization says the international community is way off track if it's hoping to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees.
So far we have heard lots of political support for enhanced ambition of mitigation, but the concrete pledges have still been missing. And at the moment, we are heading towards 2.5 to 3 degrees warming rather than 1.5 to 2 degrees.
And despite his congratulations for Australia, Boris Johnson is also casting doubt on the ability of the summit to achieve its goals.
And I'm very worried because it might go wrong, and we might not get the agreements that we need. And it's touch and go.
The Prime Minister's hoping to under-promise and over-deliver. Climate scientists say the future of the planet could depend on it.
The soft drinks industry produces about 470 billion plastic bottles every year, designed to be used just once and tossed away. Nearly a quarter are made by Coca-Cola, which has vowed to do better. However, an investigation by the BBC's Sofia Batitza has found they're struggling to make progress.
Here's refreshment you can enjoy quickly and conveniently.
In the 1950s, Coca-Cola was sold in glass bottles. The company would collect them, wash them, and reuse them.
These lighter plastic bottles take pounds off your shopping load.
By the 70s, Coke was promoting plastic.
Single-use plastic is just a massive money saver for all sorts of companies, including Coca-Cola. They use incredibly cheap plastic to make that packaging. They put it on the market and then it's job done. It's gone.
In the last 3 years alone, 156 billion of Coca-Cola's plastic bottles have been littered, burned or dumped. But Coke knew it had an image problem, so announced a plan to recycle more bottles, called World Without Waste. But if you look at the small print, there's an admission. Their bottles are only recyclable where infrastructure exists. This is the Pacific island of Samoa. In February, Coke stopped producing glass bottles here and started shipping in thousands of plastic bottles.
The population here in Samoa is only 200,000. We don't generate enough waste to have a recycling facility for plastic bottles here on the island.
Coca-Cola have set up a scheme to pay people $1 for every kilo of plastic bottles they collect. But so far, none has been exported for recycling. Halfway across the globe from Samoa is Uganda. Here, not enough bottles are being collected to meet Coca-Cola's recycling promises.
Coca-Cola says they will collect 1 bottle for each bottle they sell in Uganda, but they can never do that. They can never achieve it.
In the capital, Kampala, the recycling system largely depends on informal waste pickers. Most of them are single mothers with their children, earning around $1 a day. The whole bottled drink sector has a recycling problem. But Coca-Cola is by far the biggest company, selling 3,500 plastic bottles every second. And nearly 4 years after making their World Without Waste pledge, our investigation has revealed that Coca-Cola is struggling to make the headway required to meet their green goals.
Coca-Cola is an absolute master of greenwashing. Greenwashing is pretending that something is green when actually it is anything but green.
And evidence from Break Free from Plastic suggests that more plastic Coke packaging is littered than any other brand. Coca-Cola say they're making good progress but have a long way to go, that they're campaigning to encourage recycling in Samoa, and that they're working hard to help waste pickers. But if the biggest global plastic polluter doesn't reach its targets, the world's poorest will suffer even more.
Time now for some of your feedback. A whole bunch of you getting in touch on the vaccine mandates, more of which have been announced today. This person says they are stunned they are not required, police rather this is, stunned they are not required as they keep getting exposed to cases. Thanks for asking. This person, well done to the government with these announcements. Vaccinated people have a right to be protected. Some people here seeming supportive of more protection through state sector workers. This person, yes, of course they should lead by example. What else, therefore, is this inaction telling us? Police, MSD, all government workers and government leaders making laws for us slaves, they say, must have to walk their talk. Isn't that what leaders are? It seems sensible that the police should be double vaxxed as they have so much frontline contact with the public. That's Gabriel with that one. Police have unique powers to move right up to people, whether they are apprehending someone, restraining a mentally ill person, or just doing a random breath test. They spend a lot of time in indoor environments with vulnerable people, in their homes, in emergency departments, in police stations. Absolutely, they should be vaccinated. The public is entitled to that protection. That's from Raywin. It seems shocking that people will be fired from work if they don't get vaccinated. What happened to freedom of choice? Another person with their thoughts there. This person wondering on any news on schools, years 1 to 10 returning to school. That's from Owen. And no, there wasn't, Owen, you didn't miss that. The Prime Minister said it's up to the Education Minister, Chris Hipkins, to announce that. That's it from us today. The Late News team will keep you updated throughout the night. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi a pōpō. Tomorrow from 5, First Up speaks to the co-owner of one of Northland's most iconic pubs, who says he's prepared to shut up shop and go back to level 3 if vaccination rates don't increase. From me and the whole Checkpoint team, have a lovely evening.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Staff working in businesses including hospitality, gyms and hairdressing have 4 weeks to get vaccinated against COVID-19 or risk losing their job under the government's new mandate. The former Prime Minister, Helen Clark, has told an international conference that the pandemic has led to extreme poverty worldwide. Many Auckland students who have returned to school for the first time in 9 weeks say they're relieved to be back. It's hoped Fonterra's record forecast payout will boost rural economies. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7.
We have a huge